Now we have our second session of this afternoon, International Trade, Reinventing a Level Playing Field in the Age of Economic Security. That will be moderated by Georg, but I'd like to first introduce our keynote speaker for this, Rob Stewart, the Deputy Minister of International Trade of Canada. Hello, Minister. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Sorry to keep you waiting. You were scaring me a minute calling me a minister. I'm not a minister.
Oh.
I'm a deputy minister, which is more important. Because I survive when governments change. So I actually have a long-term job. It's very loud. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. It was to be the Minister of International Trade for Canada, newly appointed Minister of International Trade, Sidhu. Unfortunately, his schedule changed, as they do. And what do government officials do when ministers' schedules change? They fill in. So here I am. And maybe it's a good thing, but I've been doing trade for longer than the minister, which has been 2 weeks. So I might be able to tell you a little more. But I do ask you to forgive me if the flow of these remarks is not particularly polished, because it has been kind of short-noticed. So it's an honor to be here, really, and to speak to you, and to have the opportunity to hear on the panel some very astute trade, business, and economic thinkers. I'm really looking forward to that. The forum today, I have to say, am I really not too loud? Speaks to the growing interconnectedness of trade and economic security. And the topic's very timely because we were just meeting in Paris yesterday at the OECD meetings on the margin. The G7 ministers of trade were meeting. And this is in advance of the G7 summit, which is coming up June 15th, 16th in Kananaskis, Alberta. So very timely for me to be able to come and talk to you a little bit about how the G7 see trade and economic security. As I think Commissioner Sefcovic said this morning, free and open global trade has been hugely beneficial to people around the world. But we are entering into a new paradigm where trade and investment are being affected by really unprecedented challenges. In the first place, big global structural imbalances. That's maybe not unprecedented, but they're reaching the kind of highs they reached in the mid-2010s to 2020s, which is very destabilizing. Aggressive economic policies leading to market disruption. A multilateral system of trade rules which is not being fully respected, and in some cases disrespected, or effective in dealing with it. An inability generally to deal with systemic non-market policies and unfair trading practices that threaten the security, resilience, and competitiveness of our industries. And on top of all of that, increasing instances of economic coercion that leverage trade dependencies. So as a trading nation, Canada believes predictability in trade rules are fundamental to prosperity and key to averting conflict and instability. But where the rules are lacking, we need other measures to address these complex challenges. Now, it's no surprise that addressing economic security threats while seeking more open and fair trade is a key priority for most countries. The challenge is finding the balance and a way forward that doesn't undermine the system and that strengthens our competitiveness. We have to face some harsh realities. The US is taking measures to restore their view of fair trade that drive wedges and are not consistent with their trade obligations. In response, countries are acting in their interests and potentially making arrangements or deals with the United States that run the risk of derogating from their MFN commitments to other people, fraying the system, as it were. And it's clear that the system of trade rules is falling short in maintaining fairness and limiting the rise of economic security risks. And here I'm talking about China and its adherence to WTO rules, which is, in many cases, in form as opposed to in substance. However, in the short run, many countries lack the reflex or the toolkit, or maybe the readiness to use it, to respond to economic security challenges. Not all countries have the same exposures, so there are varying degrees of incentive to support reform. All of that makes this forum on reinventing the level playing field very important. I want to talk to you about three things. I used to work for a guy who used to say, not two, that's too few, not four, nobody remembers number three, three things. The threats and challenges that are destabilizing the playing field, Canada and the G7's evolving approach to economic security, and the way ahead. On threats and challenges, what do I mean? Perhaps I don't need to explain this to you, but I will say a few words about it nonetheless. Threats to key economic assets, strategic sectors, and ultimately to national security. And in simple terms, the nexus of trade and security that erodes our national security capacities and sources of long-term prosperity. There are many examples of this. Actors exploiting research partnerships and foreign investments to gain access to resources, knowledge, and technology, threats to cybersecurity and critical infrastructure, growing instances of economic coercion and leveraging or weaponization of trade dependencies to exert pressure or shift trade and investment flows, efforts by some countries to dominate strategic sectors, often through non-market policies and practices such as pervasive subsidies. Now, data-based evidence has demonstrated that non-market policies and practices give decisive advantages in strategic sectors. And one of our panelists here today from Rhodium Group has done some excellent work recently in this respect, and I want to laud them for that work. So, second area, G7. Canada is the presidency of the G7. We're holding the summit. At the beginning of the year, we created a new role within the structure of officials that oversee the preparation for the summit. It's a Sioux Sherpa role, if you know the language, reporting to the Sherpas, who are the primary officials. And we called it the Economic Resilience and Security Senior Official. And we asked all the members of the G7 to appoint one. And I am Canada's URSO. And if you'll not forget the title if you think about another word in English that sounds like that. My role is convening these URSOs. I'm going to say it more than once, so get over it. And assimilating the work in the various tracks under the G7. As some of you may know, there are many tracks in the G7, ministerial tracks, and within the ministerial tracks, many working groups. And so economic security, as you would imagine, sprawls across these working groups, including the finance track, the trade working group, the coordination platform on economic coercion, the investment screening experts group, at least 3 cybersecurity working groups, critical minerals experts working group, transportation supply chains working group, semiconductors point of contact working group. I won't go on, but I'm just illustrating for you that in the architecture of the G7, there are officials on an ongoing basis who get together to talk about critical issues. And in the current context, economic security is really coming to the fore. The URSO agenda includes sharing information, fostering dialogue, engaging with industry. In Canada's year, the B7, the Business 7, focused on economic security in their summit and published a communique, which I commend to you because it was some very good work on economic security from an industrial point of view. And it's also about outreach, and I'll come back to outreach later on. What are our target outcomes? Obviously, improving supply chain resilience and strategies for a short list of critical goods. Protecting against threats, which includes sharing information on tools and approaches. Promoting resilience, which includes deepening our understanding of the impact of NMPPs. And I'll note that the finance track has just delivered, in conjunction with the international organizations, specifically the IMF and the OECD, a very good think piece on guidance for assessing overcapacity and non-market policies and practices. So that's not a public document, but it's a document we can use as a reference point. And I think a big issue we've been grappling with lately is how to find a foundation, a baseline, in which to talk about non-market policies and practices. Again, the Rhodium work helps. So that work will go on and be passed on to the trade track to look at the impact of NMPPs in various sectors, and that work will in turn drive policy and dialogue. Overall, the aim of the exercise is to reduce economic security risks, build toolkits, deter abuses of the system, and promote resilience. So what is the way ahead? Economic security and resilience will be elements of the macroeconomic discussion at the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta on June 15th, 16th, and 17th, including the outreach session. The outcomes of the leader dialogue are, I have to say, TBD. Don't think any of us really know how that's going to work out. Obviously, we're hoping it's a very constructive dialogue, but nonetheless, the URSO work will carry on. And collectively, we'll aim to deepen dialogue, armed with clear understanding, with countries that are exposed to risks, with countries who give rise to risks, and with industry to collaborate strategically. We'll look to redefine the appropriate balance of tools and adherence to rules. And we'll try to start and continue the conversation on reforming the global architecture, such as the W2 rules for subsidies and countervail. At a jurisdictional level, all the members of the G7, and probably other countries, are work to develop our domestic capacity and ensure the resilience of strategic sectors. We'll support businesses to diversify trade and supply chains. We'll look to strengthen our toolkits, and here the EU is a very, I think, a good example of a jurisdiction that's done a lot to strengthen its economic security toolkit. But that includes things from modernizing investment screening, improving protections for research, trade remedy tools. So I do commend the ES, the economic security doctrine that the EU is working on. Ultimately, we all want to raise awareness of risks. So the theme today's, I'm going to conclude here, the theme today's session is reinventing the level playing field for international trade. How do we do that? By coming to terms with the drivers of unfair trade, fostering dialogue, and acting collectively and individually to address the economic security risks and promote reform. Discussions among like-mindeds, including at the G7, confirm we share many common concerns, desire for action, and recognition we cannot go it alone. And everybody appreciates the urgency of the moment and the need to re-level the playing field. We recognize we're stronger when we work together and pull out a united front. But ultimately, we need to restore a reformed global system of trade rules that serves us all, has served us all, and should serve us all so well. Just conclude by paraphrasing Oscar Wilde. Some people cause relief wherever they go. Others, whenever they go. I hope I'm not in the second category. Thank you very much.
Mr. Stewart, thank you so much. I'm not going to make the mistake of calling you Minister Stewart. Deputy Minister Stewart, thank you for kicking us off so excellently, including with Oscar Wilde, but more importantly, with a lot of reflection and thought to the question we're dealing with in this panel, International Trade, Reinventing Level Playing Field in the Age of Economic Security. And I think you set out very clearly a number of the challenges we will be discussing now. For that, we have an excellent panel that I'd like to invite up on stage. Agatha Kratz, the partner of the Rhodium Group. Dan Mullaney, who is Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and former Assistant USTR Representative for Europe. We have Maria Martin Pratt, Deputy Director General of DG Trade. And we have George Mina, Deputy Secretary, Trade and Investment Group of the Department of Foreign Affairs of Trade and Australia. And we have, not least, Albert Park, Chief Economist of the Asian Development Bank. Just take your seats as you find them, and let's get going. I wanted to be very direct in my first question, and it's a question actually to all of you. Is the WTO, with its rules, MFN, non-discrimination. Is it still alive? Is it live and kicking? Or is it dead? Who wants to start? Dan, I'm looking at you.
Okay.
Voice from the US, of course, you no longer represent the US administration.
I will vote alive, and I will vote kicking, with the caveat that I think some of the WTO rules need reforming. The WTO itself needs reforming. I think everybody agrees with that. And I think a lot of the trials and the turbulence and the disturbances recently reflect the fact that the multilateral rules of the road haven't necessarily kept up with the challenges that we're facing today, including the prevalence of non-market economy policies and practices and other phenomena in the global economy. So alive, but in need of some reform and reformulating.
So it's reformable. But what do we do when non-MFN deals start spreading across the world like wildfire under the pressure of coercion?
Well, I think I would maybe couch it less in terms of under pressure of coercion than some of the discussions that are happening now are triggered by some serious concerns, and particularly coming from the United States with respect to remanufacturing, with respect to trade deficits, with respect to competition from unfair sources in China. And so I think what we're seeing now is a range of bilateral negotiations aimed at trying to address the challenge and trying to address it in a new way. I think one of the examples that we've already had of that were the discussions that the United States and the EU had with respect to steel and aluminum, where faced with the challenge of non-market economy, excess steel and aluminum, the US and the EU got together to negotiate some arrangement that could facilitate trade in market economy steel, sustainable steel, and sort of disincentivize steel that were not traded on those bases. And I think those kinds of discussions where you're looking at some arrangement that somehow incentivizes that kind of trade and disincentivizes the other, I think those are the kinds of discussions we need to have to develop new sets of norms for how to approach global trade.
Okay, excellent. So you're framing this in terms of dealing with the China issue, if you want, which is perfectly understandable. And we have people on this panel that know China very well. So in sort of the sequence of people, and I can ask this question, why don't I go then to you, Agatha? What do you think about the WTO? Can it be made fit for the China challenge? I guess that's sort of a diplomatic way of describing, or a way of describing what Dan was also describing.
Yeah. I unfortunately don't think it's fit for the China challenge for a number of reasons. I think what we're watching happen at the moment in China is excessive manufacturing capacity being built with an export-oriented goal at a scale, at a speed that's just never been seen before. And the WTO is well positioned when it comes to tackling non-market practices, but the problem is that China's non-market practices go beyond what's covered under the WTO. We have kind of documented that in great length, but a lot of what China does is countervailable, but a whole lot of what it does is not. For example, excessive financing in the system, systemic support to companies, the fact that even non-state actors will participate in China's industrial policy. All of this, you can't really tackle with the WTO. So you've got a problem of just the definition of subsidies and the definition of the problem at stake. You've got a problem of scale. The scale of what China is doing is very hard to catch under the WTO. It's a systemic overcapacity problem, and it's also a problem that sees China exporting 1 million more cars in 2024 than it did in 2023. That's pretty much France's whole car production, right? So within a year, in a zero-sum market, because the market's pretty much flat, China is just taking away 1 million cars from someone else, right? So the scale of it is extremely, extremely high. The speed of it, China has expanded its export market. Within 3 years, it's captured almost 5% shares, global market shares. It's just tremendous, right? And so can we react when we have tools like TDIs in Europe or the WTO? Can we react fast enough when we have a challenge like this? And then we've got a last problem, I think, is that, I'm not completely sure China wants to play ball with the WTO either, right? In terms of course, subsidy, transparency, but also because, with a very, very basic case, like the EV case that the EU launched just a few years ago, that is warranted, that is legal, that is just based on evidence that subsidization is happening in the system. You've got China reacting with a counter case on brandy that, by the way, if you go through the MOFCOM document, says we have an overcapacity problem in Europe with brandy, right? So it's just a whole lot of issues with it, and so I'm not completely sure it's fit. To your first question, which is the WTO dead? I think at this stage we're in a Frankenstein version of the WTO, right? It's neither dead nor alive. It looks a little bit like what it was, but it's not exactly it, and it's not getting better by the day.
All right, thank you for that. Albert, may I go to you next? You're a keen and astute observer of all this from the Asian Development Bank. You follow China very closely. How do you see China's insertion into rules-based trade, capacity, and willingness to deal with such concerns, and also China's own legitimate interest that it is obviously looking after?
Sure. Well, first of all, broadening it to Asia more broadly. And I should point out that, a lot of the economic dynamism of Asia is shifting away from China, where we're seeing slowing growth, very steady decline in productivity growth, whereas the more dynamic economies are India and Southeast Asia. And so I think they should be equally talked about in terms of engagement and opportunity, especially for investment and for engagement with Europe. In the region, one product of the incredible trade uncertainty that we're experiencing is that most governments of the region really want to double down on deepening regional economic integration and global economic integration, because they view that as important for maintaining opportunities for their own development through global engagement. And so at the ASEAN leaders meeting that just occurred last week, we saw a lot of language about deepening these commitments. We saw a separate session with the Gulf Cooperation Council and China to deepen integration. ASEAN has tried to stay non-aligned politically. They've also collectively vowed not to retaliate against U.S. Reciprocal tariffs. And I think there have been a number of countries, including, I think, Japan and Korea, who have really tried to stick to an MFN principle in how they negotiate with the U.S. administration about trying to avoid the reciprocal tariffs. So I think WTO is alive, certainly in spirit, in the sense that in Asia, countries understand that they have benefited from open multilateral trade and investment, and they would like to see a stronger WTO. And so there's support for that, even though as an institution, certainly there's a lot of challenges. WTO also, I think, needs to step up and lead discussions in new areas, even if it is in the form of pluralistic agreements, that if we can't get everyone aligned, at least like-minded countries can get together. Especially one critical issue facing the region and the world is trade in environmental goods and services, which is a very casualty of all of the geopolitics, but is so important to maintain open trade in environmental goods and services for the sake of accelerating our transition to net zero, which is existential for the globe. Now on China, although I kind of disagree, I think it's important. Let me put it this way: if you go to a forum in Asia where people are talking about the same issues about having open trade despite all of the current challenges, they'll say many of the same things that we've been saying here about staying committed to rules-based trade. But a big difference is they'll be including China in that discussion, and there won't be the kind of simplistic caricature of China as this devious country trying to take over the world, which isn't to say they don't see challenges of the production capacity, et cetera. But they also, many of them, admire China for its achievements, that it has achieved double-digit growth for 3 decades for a country where everyone was poor to start, They see China's capabilities in terms of technology as a source of investment, as an important market. And so they take a very balanced view, and they really make an effort to engage China and engage China in the dialogues. And I think that's actually the right recipe for Europe as well. Now, even if we think that the extent of export increases are historic from China, I still think it's important to engage them on the same issues in the same way through the WTO principles. We have anti-dumping provisions, we have countervailing duty provisions, we have safeguard provisions, and if there are new categories of different types of subsidies, et cetera, I think we need to be clear about those and get evidence and data and engage. I liked the comment in the first speech this morning saying, in Europe we negotiate, we don't leave the table, we don't isolate, we engage, right? And I still think that's the only way to understand and realize some of the benefits of China, which is a very complex country, actually. It's dealing with a lot of challenges itself. I think it recognizes that it needs to rebalance away from exports and boost domestic consumption. The government has said this year boosting consumption is its #1 priority because it realizes it's creating these geopolitical tensions. I don't think it's quite gotten there in terms of all of the measures that would need to do that, but there certainly is an awareness of these things. And so I think productive engagement is still the right recipe.
Excellent. Maria, can I then maybe turn to you? Albert was saying this is a lot about a question about engaging China. Have we in Europe failed to engage China enough around these issues? We heard examples from steel this morning, obviously examples from car sector Tagata is taking. Has there been a lack of engagement? Is that the path going forward? Are you hopeful of that? And another point I think is interesting in what Albert is saying, he's pointing to Japan, Korea in discussions now with the US, refusing to go into deals that would sort of throw WTO principles out of the window. I presume that is also the EU stance. How strong do you think that sort of coalition around the world is?
Okay. So you don't want me to talk about the WTO?
But it is that the last question is a question about the WTO, and you're welcome to answer also the first question.
Yes, I also wanted to make my point on the WTO, but on the engagement with China, and you hear Commissioner Šefčovič this morning, we do have a very intense engagement with China. Now, engagement is not something you want to do for the sake of engagement. Engagement is something you want to do to get to results. And that's where we want to get, but that's where we have not gotten yet. But in terms of raising with China issues related to overcapacities, issues related to the market access problems we have to get to their markets, the lack of a level playing field once you are in their market. At the moment, and I think this is in the mind of everybody and it's being discussed by everybody, the problems that created by the application of export controls on rare earths, but also critical raw materials and permanent magnets and other technologies. All these issues are being raised with China. And I think the message is being passed as well to China that, look, the actions you are taking are pushing others to get away from the openness and the rules-based trade that you have profited from for so long. So in a way, it's my hope that rather than denying what is being repeated by many players, and some of these problems are not European Union problems or Australia problems. These are problems for everybody. Overcapacity, for instance, hits developing, emerging countries. So the engagement with China is absolutely necessary, and we will continue. And Commissioner Šefčovič is spent in a short period of time a lot of time in this front, and the President of the Commission has always said as well how important it is to risk via diplomacy and engagement as well. So that's clear. On the WTO point, it is alive. Every time I get this question, I think people should think about it. I mean, if it didn't exist, for instance, in the case of the European Union, 55% of our trade happens on the basis of WTO tariffs and commitments. So if it didn't exist, problems will be out there immediately. And this is our case. We are a bloc with the largest number of FTAs. Just think what the effects will be for many other countries that have less of a network of FTAs and bilateral relations. So yes, it is alive. I don't know what is kicking. It should probably be kicking a few. But what is very clear is that it's in need, and I don't think anyone denies this, of a deep reform as regards the disciplines, as regards decision-making, and as regards dispute settlement. I mean, on those three fronts, there are very, very important changes that are required. And what we are missing at the moment and what we need to build is a common purpose amongst all of its members. It cannot be that you have a few friends of the system. We need everybody there. And the responsibility applies to everybody, whether you are developing an emerging or a developed country. It is only if we get to that common purpose, it's only if we all play as responsible players that we're going to be able to get to that reform. Otherwise, yes, we risk getting to a situation where there will be less of a relevance and more of a look for alternatives to the WTO, which will be a suboptimal outcome, a very, very suboptimal outcome in my view.
Yes, we're possibly moving very fast into suboptimal outcomes, but maybe there's time still to go for better solutions. But turning then to George, you're the last one to of course, Deputy Minister Stewart has spoken already, but George, how does this global trade picture look from Australia? What are your essential interests you're trying to preserve now in terms of the system and the balancing act also between the US and China?
Well, firstly, congratulations on the forum. Thank you, Rob, for your speech. You're always one of my favourite URSAs, so you always have my vote. I think the system is clearly a system that is moving away from rules and towards power, increasingly towards power. It's been blessed by this extraordinary contribution of a multilateral structure that we hold to a high standard, but it achieves at a high standard. No other global regime, whether it's in security, environment, climate, has quite the force of the global trading system. You have a system of 60 treaties at the World Trade Organization, on which is built 400 free trade agreements. It's the biggest area of public international law. It's the most enforceable area of public international law, and it's kicking. In the last 4 years, it's produced 4 major global trade deals. Fisheries subsidies are fully multilateral, deals on investment, services, digital trade. I mean, this is kicking. Now, of course it is under serious strain with the rise of economic security, and what I would say is, in line with the theme of this conference, levelling the playing field, we don't just have to tilt the playing field a little bit back into levelling, we also have to think about the holes in the playing field, the vulnerabilities, and we need, of course, targeted and precise areas of restriction to deal with economic security vulnerabilities. So that's a serious issue, and we need to supplement the rules with those disciplines that address those holes in the playing field. And there's some bumps that are emerging in the playing field as well, these so-called non-market practices. These bumps need ironing out. And there's no question that there's going to have to be a serious effort. I can see the work that's going on in the G7, and I applaud that work, to analyse those bumps, but we need to do more. We need to start to construct some analytical frameworks, some disciplines and some cooperative action to deal with those bumps. So if we can deal with the holes and the bumps and restore a bit more evenness in this playing field, I think we will be able to return to more global cooperation in favour of a rules-based trading system, one that does not involve quite the exercise of power. So that's what we're looking for in Australia. My minister has just hosted a major meeting of the world's trade ministers, 24 of the world's top trade ministers in Paris. And Australia hosts that every year. Minister Farrell from Australia hosted it again this year. We had ministers from Canada, from the European Union, from China, the United States. We had all the top ministers there, and they were there to talk about one issue, and that was the World Trade Organization. So if it's dead, it's funny that they're all still showing up. And they were there to look at this question of whether we can find a viable future for reform. And the answer resoundingly was people are interested in that future. It's going to be hard. There's no boilerplate or template out there. But the work is starting in plurilateral groupings like the G7, like some other groups at the WTO, where there's work underway on industrial subsidies and these non-market practices. So the cooperative energy is there.
Cooperative energy is back in the sense, Liberation Day, if I'm hearing you correctly, has given all the others an injection of vitamins to get serious about getting the system working again. Dan, turning back to you then, do you think, once the US has done its rounds, spoken to all these partners, been looking for deals, trying to convince them to deal with China on American terms, do you think the US administration, this one or a future one day will say, actually, we need to start preserving and building on what's already there, those hundreds of treaties?
I do think so, yes. I do think so, yes. I mean, it is important to emphasize that WTO does a huge amount of work in terms of transparency, in terms of negotiations, in terms of even dispute resolution. I mean, even without an appellate body, dispute resolution continues. So it serves a hugely important role, and as colleagues have pointed out, when you have meetings related to the WTO, ministers show up. I mean, you do care about that. I think what we're seeing now is a reflection of the fact that the trading system that was developed after the war is not really working that well for a number of members, and notably the United States. It doesn't mean that that it's not worth having a system, not worth having a global system, but the rules that we have had in place for many decades now are no longer fit for purpose, addressing the new challenges. And this includes not just non-market economy policies and practices. And I very deliberately did not say China, because I don't think it's really much about China per se. It's about a system of rules, a system of state enterprises, of subsidies, of excess capacity that kind of fall between the slats of what was envisioned when the WTO was first put in place. After the war, countries got together and developed a brand new trading system to address the realities at that time. We haven't had a war, but we've had similar disruption where the old system doesn't really work exactly in the same way. And my view is we're in a moment where bit by bit, partner by partner, group by group, we will work on ways to address these challenges in a meaningful way. How do you address these new subsidies that were not envisioned by the subsidies agreement? How do you focus on anti-dumping where you have a non-market economy and therefore not easy measures of fair market value? These are all questions that I think have to be sorted out. And you can do this one of two ways. One way, which is maybe a civil law approach, is for everybody, 194 countries, to sit around a big table and start to hash out rules. And that'll probably happen in about 150 years. Or you get down to brass tacks and you start country by country, issue by issue, sorting through, okay, what are the obligations? What are the things that we would like to see in a relationship that will address this particular form of non-market economy excess capacity, this particular form of state enterprise control, this particular form of intellectual property theft. Go down the range of the issues. And it's not just the non-market economy policies and practices, it's the effect that some of the current trading rules have had on our supply chain resilience. And everybody has acknowledged, and this was pointed out, it made painfully acute during COVID, that our dependence on supply chains was over the top, and that was in part because of the rules that had been in place. So you have supply chain resilience, you have the issue of renewed manufacturing, which the United States has an interest in, I think Europe has an interest in. There've been a lot of negative impacts of the current trading systems, I think, need to be addressed. It doesn't mean that all the rules need to be thrown out or that MFN is no longer a thing. But I think you need to look at all of those rules and match them up against the challenges that we've been faced with and see what the new rules should be. And in some ways, the best way maybe to do that is for the United States and the UK to sit down and say, okay, let's sort out this steel and aluminum problem. Let's sort out this pharmaceutical problem, which they said they would do. Let's sort out this problem with automobiles. US and European Union sit down and do the same thing. And with specific facts on the ground and specific issues, can you devise a set of rules that govern the relation between those parties that do meet the new challenges in a way that current rules don't? If you're going to look long-term and speculate, and this is a personal view, you have enough of these deals out there being developed bilaterally. At some point, you may start to develop some new norms which could ultimately be multilateralized. And I think when that happens, yes, you would get buy-in from everybody on those new rules. But those new norms probably have to be developed on a case-by-case basis with individual partners on individual issues, and probably not in a traditional WTO consensus-oriented negotiation.
All right, so piecing it back together, piece by piece, addressing these issues. Deputy Minister, coming back to you. I mean, Dan sort of sketched out the 150-year scenario, not workable, bringing everybody into a room, that won't work, versus having some key trusted partners to do this together with. For Canada, who are sort of the key trusted partners do you think you can have a good conversation with China with, for instance, on overcapacity in a credible manner, and that will have effect? And Dan said something else. He said something, well, you have everything that's happening bilaterally, but you pointed to formats, plurilateral formats. Of course, Canada is part of it, it's key there. Australia is the CPTPP. It's just been announcements of talks, structured dialogue, or strategic dialogue, what it's called, between the EU. Is that such a format? Is that the kind of discussions that are taking place now? How one can use these formats to push forward an agenda that can answer some of these points that you've been raising?
Well, let me come at that a couple of different ways. First of all, if you think about the global trading system as it's working right now, you know, in some very fundamental ways, it's working, right? People are adhering to the rules. Maria said that. And the derogations are kind of at the margin, right? And some of them are extreme, right? The US tariffing is extreme. And China weaponizes trade as well in a way that's not WTO compliant. So, you know, there are derogations, but the core of the thing is kind of intact. Reforming it is a huge effort. And here there's an issue that hasn't surfaced, but it's governance, right? I mean, the problem with the WTO is essentially its consensus-based decision-making, which can be blocked by one country, and often it's a country, same country, which was kind of apparent the other night, I'm sorry to say. But at any rate, you know, you can't change the WTO easily. The problems are at the margin, so you work at them in various ways around, right? And the JSIs within the WTO are evidence of where countries have come to agreement. plurilateral agreements outside the WTO, and I think more increasingly we'll see, a variance on plurilaterals, which will be maybe slightly challenging to the orthodoxy of the WTO, but there are ways of showing like-minded countries getting together. And I think there are a lot of countries in the world that want to maintain rules-based trade, right? CPTPP is a good example. And a dialogue with the EU is going to be good. To have that and talk about it and show the world that we believe in rules-based trade. But you start with the G7, maybe set the US aside for the time being because they have other objectives, and then kind of broaden to Korea, Australia, other very developed countries, and then eventually at the margin, in terms of outreach on these issues and the discussion about whether the global trading system, you want to get to the countries that are aspirants. Indonesia applying to join the CPTPP, for instance, is a good example of that. Anybody who's seeking to accede to the OECD is a good example, frankly, of that. So I think there's groupings here that'll help us get to where we want to go with the derogations from the rules. I don't think we'll ever really tell the US what to do, but I think China has an interest in being a player by the rules, right? And I think there's a degree to which calling it out has its own effect. So the non-market policies and practices examinations that are going on are, I think, in a subtle way, influential. I don't think any one country carries the baton when talking to China. I think it is about talking to them in multiple fora. And then I think all countries have a dialogue with China where we should be calling out. And I do want to emphasize one other point, which is that economic security is not just limited to trade, right? It's a much bigger piece of territory. And there are a lot of other issues that have to be taken up in that context. And we all have those conversations with China about cybersecurity, about research security, et cetera. So just to say, it's a complicated game, but there's ways to move the ball forward.
I find a lot of, if not optimism, but at least can-do spirit in this panel. Much more than I had expected. Maybe, and that's good to hear. But returning to you, Agatha, I mean, you're a China expert. And Maria was pretty clear. She said there's been no failure of engagement with China. Deputy Minister Stewart is saying this trade, there's also a series of other serious issues. We were discussing cybersecurity in the previous session. There are grave concerns now around critical minerals and so on and so forth. Do you think China is ready to change its model to preserve stability, to save the WTO, to keep on good terms with Rob and George and Dan and Maria?
It's the most important question, probably. You've got it right. I want to say, first and foremost, I agree with Maria and I agree with other panelists that engagement with China is absolutely necessary, right? Like, that wasn't my point to say the WTO is not fit to deal with China. Engagement needs to absolutely be the bare bone of what we're doing here. There needs to be dialogue, there needs to be engagement, there needs to be communication about what the EU is doing, what the US is doing. And so I don't want to undermine this because it's absolutely, and underestimate this, is absolutely core. I think my point, and I'll get to your question in a minute, but I think my point is to say we've had that communication with China for 15 years now, right? The solar PV case was more than 10 years ago. The first round of Chinese overcapacity was more than 10 years ago. The first question of whether China should be named a market economy was more than 10 years ago, and since then, meetings after meetings after meetings and communications after communications after communications have happened to say there's a problem here, we're worried. There's a problem here, we are worried. And so I don't want to underplay this. We have been communicating, we are communicating, we need to keep communicating, but some of it is not coming through, or there is a reluctance on the other side to do something about it. And I think this is the importance of my point. To your question, is China willing to engage? It's willing to talk. It's willing to create a process to talk. Whether it's willing to act is a different question. I want to make very clear that it is first and foremost in China's interest to change its model. because China's model is investment-based, it's debt-based, it's capital-based in a way that's not sustainable. We've known that for years, right? And China's known that for years. And at some point, to be able to grow at 4 or 5%, China needs to be able to transition to a model that's lighter in capital, lighter in investment, more focused on services, more focused on internal consumption, less focused on export, right? And so it is good for China, and it is first and foremost in China's interest to change. The second thing to say that's very important is China knows about this. The problem is reforming an 18 trillion economy that is a middle-income economy going to become almost an advanced economy is extremely hard. Don't get me wrong. And we've seen, we've seen a lot of attempts of China over the past 10 years to reform the system, reform the capital account, reform the financial system, reform SOEs. But it is extremely, extremely painful to reform. Everyone knows that. And it's extremely painful to reform in a context where political power is so closely linked to economic growth, right? And so what China would have to do, what it would take for it to reform in a way that makes it less export-oriented, less manufacturing-oriented, and less capital and investment-reliant, would create social instability, would create economic instability, would create costs, enormous costs to the system, right? It's still the best way forward, but it is terribly painful. And so we understand, and everyone needs to understand how hard it is. But I think there's more that can be communicated, more that can be done, certainly, if and just to say overcapacity is a thing. I mean, we're at a level of communication now where we have Chinese counterparts denying the very existence of overcapacity. I've spent 12 months studying it, and I'm pretty confident there is overcapacity in China, going into the numbers, documenting it, right? And so I think this needs to be taken into account. While we engage, something else needs to happen, because 1 year of engagement means, once again, 1 million more cars on the global market in a market that's not growing, right? And I'm exaggerating by focusing on that number, but it's one that speaks to everyone in the audience, because Europe is an auto-making continent, so it's important. While we do this, we need to do a whole lot of other things. We need to use all of the tools that we have under WTO. We need to use them fast. The problem is last year, 2024, DigiTrade launched the most cases related to China ever, 24, if I have the count right. And that covered 3% of our trade with China, of our imports from China, right? And so yes, we can do TDIs, and yes, we can do anti-dumping, anti-subsidies, but the time it takes, and the resources it takes, and the political clout it takes to then go to China and say, this is legal. I have the right to do this. Don't go after my brandy. Don't go after pork. Don't go after dairy, please, because this is legal. I'm just doing what I can do under WTO rules. This has a cost. And so something else needs to happen in the meantime, and we need to be thinking around or at the boundaries of WTO at the very minimum, because jobs are at stake and economic growth is at stake.
But what if what China wants is for these dependencies to build up? We had Commission President von der Leyen, who came to speak at the EPC about a year ago, and it came to be known as the sort of China de-risking speech. He was traveling to China, I think it was with President Macron, and I think it was the first set-piece speech solely on China by a leader of an EU institution. And she didn't mince her words. In reality, she spoke about China as trying to reshape the international order, putting itself at its center. She spoke about the China that was actively engaging or developing policies to make others more dependent on China and China less dependent on others in order to have leverage. And you can read in the press these days about, in the context of China's technological development, in the context of, and you're right, Albert, saying a lot of this comes down to their thrift, to their extraordinary capacity of innovation, the massive resource mobilization in their economy that certainly other continents would need, for instance, to meet transitionary challenges like climate change or the energy transition. But one can read also what this is creating now in terms of worries. People are saying that soon legacy chips will all be produced in China, that other industries in other sectors in different parts of the world are facing wipeout. And one can also, of course, and that's the question of economic security, reflect on what that means in a world of tension, in a world of conflict. If Europe finds itself without any production capacity for legacy chips, for instance. We have an unfolding case now, certainly on critical minerals or rare earths. Isn't that part of what's being developed in China, building up leverage over others? Is the fundamental interest of China in the strategic rivalry with the US to have that leverage and to continue building it up? Or is it, like we maybe are suggesting also here, that no, well, they have an interest in trade, a stable trading system, meeting George, and meeting Rob, and meeting Maria somewhere towards their concerns?
Well, everyone will see it a different way. I tend to view China as a developmental state, mainly interested in promoting its continuous development. It's still not a very rich country, and it's struggling in a number of dimensions, as I mentioned. And I do think that, you know, behind all of the trade conflict between U.S. and China is these fundamental imbalances that China just saves a lot. It doesn't consume that much, and so you know, the national income accounts means that this has to show up someplace in either overinvestment or net exports. And the U.S. is the opposite, right? It's consuming a lot, not saving much. It's borrowing. And so it's going to be having a current account deficit almost, there's no other way around it. And so I think one thing not appreciated, I think, by the U.S. administration is how much the trade deficit is not just about tariffs and behaviors directly related to trade, but it's very inconsistent with a budget which is just going to increase the budget deficit and is basically more borrowing at a national level that has to kind of balance in the balance of payments. And so I think China realizes that to some extent, and so as I mentioned, there's emphasis to make progress on that. I think getting back to this idea that we kind of caricaturize China a bit. I mean, even if you look at subsidies, I mean, one thing I think that should be appreciated is that a lot of the money that China has spent on subsidies has been very badly allocated, and estimates suggest that the return on those investments have been very negative. And if you look at the most innovative firms in China that are really leading China's tech revolution, whether it be Huawei, or if you look at Alibaba, or if you look at BYD, these are great innovative firms that would have been successful with no subsidies. I'm completely convinced of that. They all have founder origin stories where they started in, you know, in Huawei, it was a barn in a rural township. You know, in Alibaba, it's these young 12 friends sitting in a garage on their notebooks starting Alibaba. And so those innovative cultures have really pulled through. Of course, they've benefited by support from the state when they have been identified as being capable, right? And so I think it's, and by the way, the other part of this is that I think from an economist standpoint, the record of industrial policy is not very good in general. There's been a proliferation of industrial policies globally, but most of those policies have been in advanced countries, not in developing countries. China's an exception. And so I also think that both the US and the EU, they're implementing industrial policies in the name of security, but it could be that these are going to really be costly investments that don't yield so much if there isn't a very strong sense of what's realistic in terms of the capabilities and strategies that don't just reshore everything. Why would you want to produce, you know, T-shirts or assemble iPhones in the US, but really try to understand how you can achieve more secure supply chains or greater economic security, but still be competitive? Because at the end of the day, if you're not really still engaged globally in competitive value chains, it's going to really be a drag on your economic future.
I think you're presenting a good case for the economic dynamics of savings and investment. But I think others would consider that there are further dimensions to this that makes it all the more complicated. But maybe sort of moving on a little bit in that conversation, and I would like to open the floor to questions from the audience also. So if there are questions that are ready, we'll get to them soon. But Dan, before going there, next steps in the sort of the current trade war. Liberation Day tariffs, it went up to astronomical levels of percentages between China and the US. You have the Geneva Accords, so a de-escalation. At the same time, many people are saying, you know, if you have tariffs at 60%, it's already prohibitive for trade. And something happened in parallel to these discussions in Geneva. There's the tightening of the screws, precisely around rare earths, critical minerals. What do you think will happen as we head into July? Will this further diffuse, or do you think this confrontation will take new forms? For instance, and we've been talking in the previous panel around tech, could it take the form on export controls on GPUs, further tightening on the screws on minerals? How do you read this crystal ball?
Well, I mean, I think putting the prediction aspect aside, I think there is a path forward. I mean, there are reasons that these tariffs are being deployed. Where you can argue that the tariffs are a very bad tool, they're a very blunt tool, but they're clearly a tool to achieve certain objectives. And so I think if the parties do sit down and focus on the objectives, which include things like supply chain diversity, and I don't think we necessarily need to be judging China's whether their industrial policy is successful or not, or whether the money is well spent or not. If the effect of all their policies and our rules is that we're overly dependent on China for critical inputs, that's a problem. Yeah. If the effect of their subsidies, however inefficiently spent, is that our companies are driven out of business, that's a problem. If the effect of non-market economy excess capacity, even if it's a very costly policy that makes no sense in China at all, but if the effect of that is companies going out of business in the United States and Europe, then that's a problem we have to do something about. But I think that if the parties can sit down and work to achieve those objectives, and they are very specific. There's a long list of them, and so a lot of people tend to criticize the list, saying, well, the administration doesn't really know what it wants. It knows what it wants. I think there's just a long list of those things that it wants. So I think if the parties sit down and try to reach arrangements that achieve the objectives with lower imposition of tariffs, or maybe even no tariffs, I think that is achievable. I think by July, make no mistake, you're not going to have a set of comprehensive agreements. You're going to have, for the parties who reach a deal, they're going to be more like framework agreements, a little bit more like the UK deal. So just to set expectations, you're going to have some framework agreement to discuss various issues that are of concern that will maybe give some breathing space. That's what I would anticipate. And ideally, if the parties stay engaged, then we end up with a set of agreements that facilitate trade, but that don't involve the big tariff numbers that we've been seeing so far. The reason I'm saying I'm not predicting that, I mean, that is a path forward. That is a very credible path forward. I think that's a path forward that all parties could agree to. I can't predict how different parties are going to react. And I know in Europe, for instance, there's a strong impulse to retaliate against the United States, hit the United States, hit them hard. China already did that. Clearly, things could spiral out of control if that happens, and you could end up with a trade war instead. But I think there is a very meaningful path forward if the parties focus on the underlying reasons that we're facing this challenge.
Did I hear you say zero tariffs are possible? That's part of what the EU is asking for. Do you think that's possible, or are we on the contrary in the situation now where all this will become very sticky? And once tariffs have gone up, it will stay that way?
Well, I think there's a certain amount of stickiness. There's been a lot of talk about this 10% tariff as being a new baseline. You know, is it a floor? I haven't heard anybody say that unequivocally, and it certainly doesn't apply, for instance, the products are under 232, so there are already holes in it. My feeling is that, you know, now I'm not talking about the MFN tariffs, which are already out there, but the new tariffs that are being proposed in the 232 cases, national security cases, or the 10% or the reciprocal tariffs, yeah, you could get those down very low if the parties agreed to things that would address the underlying concerns.
Maria, do you think the EU, Commissioner Šefčovič didn't want to make predictions on the deal this morning with the US, so I presume you will not either. But a different way of asking the question is, with all these concerns the EU has with China, is the US a partner for the EU in dealing with China? Do you think this is part of the discussions that are taking place and part of the path forward, including in discussions with the US? Well, there's been discussions under the Biden administration on steel, for instance. It didn't go all the way. I think on the EU side, one realized that, well, maybe one could try to make this WTO workable. Didn't go for the deal because of quotas, I think, in the end. Can such discussions pick up again?
Yeah, I understand what you mean. In normal circumstances, of course, the US needs the European Union in the same manner that it needs other countries around the world to address a number of the challenges created by the non-market policies and practices of China. This is clear as that. Otherwise, whether you're talking about risks related to security, or whether you are talking about the consequence of overcapacity, if you try to address them alone, there's going to be always a circumvention. So in that respect, a cooperation to address those problems is needed, a cooperation among equals, a cooperation where the interests of all the parties are taken into account. So yes, if we go back to that type of environment, we can do it.
Let's see if we get there. Questions from the audience? Second row here, Finbar first, and then, yeah, in the middle and all the way at the back.
Thank you. Question for Maria, if I might. Sorry, Maria, you must feel like I follow you around.
Please present yourself. So
Finbar Birmingham from the South China Morning Post. You must feel like I follow you around Brussels asking questions about China. Well, fair enough. I wanted to ask about some comments we've heard from the sense of frustration coming out of EU diplomats in Beijing about the lack of progress in what Beijing is willing to give, or concessions, or even to concede that there are any problems in the EU-China relationship. We heard Ambassador Toledo very frustrated talking about the lack of progress in talks on trade. The head of the EU Trade Department in Beijing also talking about how there's no meaningful progress on things like discussing overcapacity on the EV talks, etc. I wonder if you could give us an update on whether you feel like China is taking the EU's concerns seriously when it comes to trade, and whether there will indeed be a high-level economic dialogue before the summit in July. Thank you.
We can take a series of questions. We have another one in the middle. I thought you had always answered that already, Maria, about there being a lot of talk and not enough action. But yes, let's have more questions.
Hi, my name is Sato. I'm from Japan Bank for International Corporation. I think that the engagement with China is almost at the common sense right now, but and also that I think that the Chinese products is very really good actually, and the cost is in terms of the cost also very good. But Georg said that on the other hand, there are some restriction of the export control of the rare earths or critical minerals. So, as a result of the engagement, what should we aim for the relationship with China or Chinese goods? Thank you very much.
And then we have two questions all the way at the back. Maybe late. Oh, you got the microphone, and then.
Can you hear me well?
We can hear you.
Yes. Jorge Valero with Bloomberg, another journalist. Maybe to follow up on Finbar's question on the promise fatigue for Maria as well. I mean, maybe if there is one thing that you would like to see as a result of the coming summit in July, what would that be to prove that actually China is not only talking but actually delivering? And for the panel in general, and now talking about the WTO, what would be the minimum that should be achieved in the ministerial next year to kind of save the rule-based order and the multilateral order? Maybe thinking about China, I don't know if it would be industrial subsidies or something like that, or that is too ambitious to save this order and avoid falling into the power politics paradigm for the years to come.
And then a fourth question, yes, please.
Hi, Ali Renison, worked for SEC Newgate, but was formerly a government advisor on trade to the last government in the UK. Two really quick ones. One on counterfactuals, and I say this not as a sort of a dove on China in any way, shape, or form, but let's say kind of hypothetically that China does sort of start to sort of shift its economic model, focuses on domestic consumption, focuses more on services. I'm kind of wondering whether simply by sheer virtue of the size of its economy, whether because of its position as a competitor, almost in a way that wouldn't matter. They would always be seen as a sort of a bit of a threat. And then two, just really quickly on trade facilitation, slightly more sort of specific, but really interesting to see in the UK-US agreement, they talked about kind of tackling things like working together to tackle circumvention, transshipment, those kind of areas. And I think from an industry perspective, it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? Because it's great to see that cooperation, but we're starting to see in the US that a lot of these facilitations, and we know that the EU and the US and now the UK may be moving on de minimis. I mean, should business be worried about what were trade facilitations are now really being seen as this is all loopholes that we have to worry about making sure they aren't exploited?
Right, excellent. That's a good list of questions. I'm wondering, George, should we start with you? A number of these are questions you can respond to. For instance, WTO, what Cameroon is it next year?
Cameroon.
What's the minimum one needs to achieve for this to at all be on track? And you feel free to respond to the other questions also if you like.
Well, let me take that one. I think Cameroon's a massive opportunity, and it cannot be a business as usual ministerial meeting. We've got two big issue areas we need to deal with at the World Trade Organization. The first is finding our voice on the new imperatives guiding world trade. And the second is the big structural reforms to ensure the WTO can meet those imperatives. On the imperative side, every parrot in the pet shop is talking about economic security, national security, industrial policy. But what about the net zero transition and the contribution that the trading system can make to the climate fight? What about the age-old problem of agriculture and agricultural subsidies, which we haven't mentioned today? If you go to Indonesia, or you go to my neighbourhood in the Pacific, and you ask, what is economic security for you? It's food security. So I think dealing with these new imperatives, whether it be industrial policy, whether it be national security, whether it be the net zero transition, we need to start to shift the WTO's focus to them, including all of the issues we've discussed today. The second set of issues I think we've got to deal with in Yaoundé is making the WTO fit for purpose for that challenge. Decision-making needs to be loosened up so that we can do plurilaterals. Reforms to the dispute settlement system so we can drive more enforcement of the nature that we have already seen with the multi-party interim arrangement. And I know Maria and I have been spending some time with other countries working to broaden that. And of course, the long-term problem at the WTO of trying to ensure that we don't just focus on treaties, but we start to bring in more dialogue, more policy work as well. So they're the sorts of things. If we can kick those reforms off, I don't think we'll finish them, but if we can have the political energy behind starting these reform projects, I think we'll have had a success in Yaoundé.
Excellent. Rob, Deputy Minister, do you want to answer or compliment?
Maria's on the spot.
Yeah,
I thought I would end with Maria.
You'll end with Maria, okay.
So we'll do this as a final round. So we'll end with Maria,
okay.
And then she can compliment.
Okay.
Your final comments with all the rest of you.
Okay, yeah, because I'm not sure I have a specific answer to any of those questions. I do think we're in a very difficult time here. So there's a question asked about what happens in July, right? So I think there's a lot of shoes to drop between now and next February, for one thing. I also think that in a more geopolitical sense, things are very fraught. And I am quite, I think, inclined to think that we're heading for a time of somewhat managed trade. And when I say managed trade, it can take various forms. It's like the TRQs that the UK just agreed to. And I think that's going to be, on the flip side of that, I think the China conversation is going to be a very difficult conversation. And I think it's going to take some time to work to a place where there's less friction in the system and the incentives are shifting. That's my view for the sort of one-year horizon.
Dan?
So we get to pick and choose questions, I guess.
Pardon?
We get to pick and choose our questions.
Yes, you get to pick and choose your questions.
That's luxury.
No, but I think that's luxury. But I think sort of a horizon scanning exercise, as Rob just did.
I think in
is
part
interesting.
what we want from China is, I think China is big, but I think the biggest challenge with respect to China are the practices involved. So I think if in a negotiation with China, and we are negotiating with China, or in negotiations working with other countries that would similarly put pressure on China, I think the goal is to have China eliminate or mitigate at least the effects of the injurious practices on foreign commerce. Maybe change their system, although I don't think there's a lot of hope that any of these policies would change. But at least have China mitigate the impact. And I think that if you in a total counterfactual, if you weren't dealing with the non-market economy policies and practices in China, I think we would not be having this discussion right now. There are a lot of big economies in the WTO that we're happy to work with. I think it really is the practices that are the target. And I think there's a twofold strategy. One is through direct negotiation or working with allies to see if you can disincentivize those practices or the impact of those practices. And number two, if you can't mitigate those practices, at least defend ourselves against the practices. So, I think some of the conversations that the United States will likely have with its partners will be how we jointly protect ourselves, because of course if the United States just protects itself against Chinese products, the Chinese products go other places, and then those countries need to take protective measures. So that's what I would say on the China question.
That's another, in terms of U.S. relations, that's another answer in terms of proliferation of TRQs that Rob was talking about.
TRQs on?
Well, that's what you were saying. You would have a system of managed trade that will come about.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily prejudge any particular outcome. There are any number of ways that you could mitigate the impact of some of these injurious practices. TRQs may be one, but there could well be others.
All right, Agatha and Albert, where do you want to end this conversation on a note of optimism, of a can-do?
Yeah, so Dan stole my question and my answer, so well done. But just two things to add to the counterfactual, just to say China reforming would do two things that I think are not to be underestimated. The first one is more investment in emerging markets elsewhere, right? Because the counterfactual is actually much more production, much more export, much more investment in ASEAN, in Latin America, in Africa, in a lot of other places, right? There's been a little bit of a black hole phenomenon of aspiration towards China that would benefit to emerging markets. So I think that's a very big one. The other one is we wouldn't have to become more protectionist. We wouldn't have to use less money on industrial policy as much as we do today because we're so frightened of China's competitiveness and non-market practices-based competitiveness. And so that would be great because we could spend that money on something else and we've got a lot more to spend on. That wouldn't change the fact that there would be strategic and security concerns towards China, but it would make a big difference, I think.
Albert, do you see a dynamic going into Cameroon?
Yeah, so I wanted to also end on a note of optimism. I think Asia in general is really ready and very keen to engage more economically with Europe. You see it, we have Indonesia and Thailand trying to enter the OECD. We have India signing a free trade agreement with the EU. We have ASEAN itself deepening integration amongst its countries. A lot of momentum at the last meeting for a digital economic partnership agreement for all ASEAN countries to build upon the agreement that Singapore has already done with New Zealand and with Chile, and now also including Korea, and several other countries lining up. So this is kind of an example of kind of bilateral, you start to gather momentum of more countries seeing things in a common way. And everyone realizes that the stakes are very high because digitalization is really the future of a lot of growth momentum. It's the most dynamic part of international trade, and people want to be connected, to have the opportunities of that relationship. And so I think there was a comment earlier from the Carnegie Europe representative about how it's really important for Europe to think about the benefits of engagement with the South more broadly. And there are a lot of economies. They're not the old, poorer countries now. There are a lot of capabilities in many of the emerging markets in Asia. Now on China, I guess I would have two notes of optimism. One is that I think because they're experiencing a lot of domestic economic pressures, that there is more, I think, incentive to reform. ADB has been working with the Development Research Center under China State Council on studying some of the ways in which China can better promote high-quality development. And one of the topics is total factor productivity growth. We're emphasizing competition policy, being much more open. They are the Chinese side is also very interested in service sector liberalization, and we're preparing a lot of detailed evidence-based insights about what they could gain from opening up their service sectors. They also realize that this is an important part of the global economy that they want to be engaged in. So I think I'm optimistic that they will try to do something, and they're feeling this pressure. And to be honest, now with the U.S.-China relationship so fraught, I think Europe really does have some leverage. China really wants to have a productive relationship with Europe and Australia and other countries in the region, and so they should be more willing to listen as we go forward, I hope. I'm not directly interacting as some of our panelists are, so I probably can't say that with so much confidence. But the other thing is China as an investor in other countries, which was just mentioned, which has already been happening. We've seen a relocation of FDI into Asia away from in strategic sectors, meaning like telecom, semiconductors, new energy economy, shifting away from China to Southeast Asia, India, and other places. And some of that investment is actually also coming from China, right? I actually think, to answer this question about what should we ask for China, if you remember when there was concern that Japan was flooding the US with automobiles, the response was for Japan to move its production to the United States and therefore create employment, et cetera, and promote technology transfer. And in some of these sectors, especially new energy economy sectors like batteries and electric vehicles, I think there should be opportunities to try to work with Chinese companies to move production domestically. And I think that will also help accelerate the transition to electronic vehicles. One, at ADB, we're very interested in supporting all of our member countries to try to accelerate the transition to electric vehicles. And one thing I think, if you think at a big picture level, we're seeing is that the countries that produce lots of traditional cars, US, Europe, Germany, Japan, for many reasons, they're obviously protecting those sectors and fearful of cheap Chinese EVs, and maybe it's for non-competitive reasons, but what we're going to see, I think, is that the shift to electric vehicles is going to actually happen faster in the South, in other countries where they're not big producers of automobiles, but they see it as an opportunity to accelerate, to reduce reliance on fossil fuels if they're importing, to really take advantage of very high quality electric vehicles. And that's kind of a shame to me, because I always thought it should be Europe and the US and Japan leading this transition, but we may actually see it kind of the other way around.
It's a shame, but it's also a positive story for others that this transition is taking place. Well, Maria, there was some very clear questions directed directly at you. Albert just said that he thinks it's a good moment for engagement with China. There's an EU-China summit coming up. Will we move from frustrations to success, and what's sort of the benchmark of success on that? And if you'd like to do, like several of the others, end on a note of optimism on EU-China relations, or on EU-US relations, or on EU relations with CP, TPP, whatever it is. The floor is also yours for some optimism to end this session.
Okay, but that's asking for optimism these days is not necessarily a small ask. And I think that's important to keep in mind. I have the impression we've glossed a little bit about the situation. The situation is not good. The European Union has 70% of its exports to the United States and the new tariffs. We are facing trade diversion because of some of the actions being taken, and there's a huge uncertainty in the trade world. So this is not a place where we should be. But going then back to the positive side is that we are accelerating negotiations with countries that otherwise were far more, let's say, intensive in terms of the need for engagement to accelerate. We are in parallel negotiating with India, with Indonesia, with the Philippines, with Thailand, and with Malaysia. So, trade negotiators are very busy. It's almost done, Australia, isn't it?
It should be. It should be. We'll talk tomorrow.
Now, going back on China, look, there is a huge amount of work that needs to be done between now and the summit. And it is very difficult, and I'm not going to try to define what are the thresholds to define success. What I can tell you is the type of issues that we are putting to China as in need of addressing. And these are not just general structural issues, which we have been discussing with them for a long time, but we're also talking very, very specific issues, whether they are related to market access, whether it's in the area of agri, whether it's in the area of cosmetics, whether it's in the area of other types of goods. We're talking about the manner in which they apply some of their horizontal laws to the detriment of foreign players, whether you're talking about data regulation, whether you're talking about anti-espionage law. We are also obviously very intensively engaged on the issue of export controls, and this is something that has been developing very rapidly in the last few weeks, and that is very, very important. And more generally, I think the message to China is that they should not be taken for granted the openness of the European market. And I think China has realized how we have been developing a whole range of autonomous measures, what we refer to as our toolbox, and how we are ready to use those tools, whether we are talking about the foreign subsidies regulation, the international procurement instrument, TDI. So that is something that they need to take into account very seriously. Chinese investment, that is not a problem for our security, continues to be welcomed in the European Union, but increasingly there are going to be questions as to what do they bring to our general competitiveness, what's the benefit for Europe as well. So the discussion is broad and rich, and we still have a little bit of time, although not that much, until the summit.
Thank you, Maria. I think that is excellent to round off this discussion. I like hearing an EU that is affirmative, that says it's an agency, that doesn't brush the problems under the carpet. And you're also putting very precise words, I think, on common challenges and all these things that can't be taken for granted. There's a lot of things that are slipping away right now. And I think if there's anything I take away from this panel is the contribution of all of you expressing a desire to move forward and to undo the wrongs that are there, and a capacity, or at least a willingness to act, so that the things that one can't take for granted, one can try to keep them as they slip now away. So thank you very much for joining us for this panel. We'll have a coffee break for those who need that, and then we have a final session, which is about the new multipolarity, East, West, South ties. So it will stay with a lot of the same themes, but looking broader than simply trade, and trying to look at what like-minded and cooperative alliances can look for in the future. Please join me in thanking all the panelists for this conversation. Thank you so much.